There were 14 days between the date my grandmother stopped recognizing her own doctors and the date her final will was supposedly finalized. My cousin never checked the math, but checking math like that is my entire career. To understand how a family funeral turned into a legal ambush and why I ended up standing across a probate court for my own blood, I have to take you back to Newport. My name is Sarah. I'm 39 years old, and I serve as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. I've been in uniform for 12 years, and I'm currently stationed in Newport, Rhode Island at the Naval Justice School. My entire professional life is built on procedure cross-examinations and finding the singular truth buried under a mountain of carefully constructed lies. I don't spend my days shouting in dramatic courtrooms. I spend them in quiet offices, tearing apart financial logs, medical files, and sworn statements. In military law, we rely on a very simple truth. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. You don't argue with a liar. You let them talk, you secure the documents, and you wait for the paperwork to trap them. The courtroom doesn't care about your volume. It only cares about what you can prove on paper. That exact discipline is the only thing that kept me out of a jail cell when my own family tore itself apart. Before the darkness fell, my grandmother was the absolute anchor of our lives. She was 86 years old, a sharp, deeply loving woman who lived in a sprawling cedar-shingled house near the water. That house smelled of old pine, salt water, and the strong black coffee she kept brewing all day long. Every major family milestone happened at her long dining room table. On her mantel sat a tightly folded American flag, handed to her decades ago when my grandfather passed away. She spent her life building a legacy of warmth, fairness, and loyalty, but time is undefeated. In early autumn, her health collapsed following a massive stroke. We rushed her to a large regional hospital. The decline was brutal and fast. Within days, the fierce woman who had anchored our family was replaced by a fragile patient who could barely keep her eyes open. Her cognitive functions plummeted. The doctors were very clear from the first night that the damage was extensive and irreversible. This is when my cousin stepped in. We'll call him Marcus. He was a man who ran a struggling local real estate business, but projected the image of a titan of industry. He wore suits that were a little too shiny, drove a leased luxury car he could barely afford, and always needed to be the loudest voice in the room. He also harbored a deep, quiet condescension for my military service. To him, because I was a woman who drew a government salary and followed a strict chain of command, I didn't understand real business or real estates. He saw me not as a trial attorney, but as a glorified secretary in a uniform. When our grandmother was hospitalized, Marcus moved in like a conquering general. Because I was constrained by a demanding instructional schedule on base, I could only visit in the evenings. Marcus, boasting about his flexible civilian schedule, appointed himself her absolute caretaker. During the very first week, while she was still occasionally lucid, he produced a heavy stack of papers and secured her signature on a durable power of attorney. He stood in the hospital corridor wearing his shiny suit and told the family it was just a procedural necessity. He said he needed the legal authority to pay her property taxes and keep the lights on at her house so we could focus on her recovery. We were too consumed by shock and grief to argue. We trusted our own blood. If you've ever trusted someone simply because they were family, only to realize they were quietly building a cage around you, you know exactly how cold that realization feels. If you value stories where the quiet ones read the fine print and win, consider subscribing as we walk through this. Once Marcus had that legal authority, an invisible wall went up. He became the absolute gatekeeper to her hospital room. If I came to visit after a long shift at the base, he was always there, standing between her bed and the door. He began restricting visiting hours, claiming the nurses said she was too fatigued for company. He controlled her phone. He intercepted conversations with her attending physicians. I noticed small, unsettling details. Whenever I walked into the room in my service khakis, Marcus would quickly slide his phone into his pocket or snap his leather briefcase shut. He'd pat my shoulder, use a patronizing tone, and tell me to head back to base and let him handle the heavy lifting. I didn't confront him. I didn't know exactly what he was doing with his exclusive access to her accounts, but I felt the warning bells going off. Instead of shouting, I fell back on my training. You don't react to a suspicion without intelligence. You observe. During her final weeks, her mind simply let go. She forgot she was in a hospital. One evening, I sat by her bed and held her frail hand, and she looked right through me and called me by my late mother's name. The medical staff meticulously documented every bit of this severe cognitive loss in her daily charts. In late November, with a bitter wind coming off the Atlantic, she passed away quietly on a Tuesday morning. The family was devastated. We buried her on a freezing Friday under a heavy gray Rhode Island sky. It was an exhausting day that wrung every drop of emotion out of us. After the service, the extended family gathered back at her house for the reception. The mood was heavy. People stood in the kitchen and the living room wearing their dark coats, holding small paper cups of coffee, whispering condolences and trying to process the massive void she had left behind. The morning had barely begun. Then Marcus walked into the center of the living room. He wasn't crying. His posture was perfectly rigid. He was clutching a thick, pristine manila envelope. He cleared his throat loudly, a sharp, grating sound that silenced the low hum of conversation. He didn't ask for our attention. He demanded it. And before the house had even settled, before anyone had even finished shedding their grief, he announced that as the executor of her estate, we were doing a formal reading of her final will. Right there, right then. The entire living room went completely still. It was a profoundly inappropriate ambush. A funeral reception is meant for shared memories, quiet sorrow, and slow healing, not estate administration. My aunts and uncles exchanged bewildered looks. Some set their coffee cups down on the wooden end tables as if the sound of porcelain might somehow disturb the heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus did not care. He stood near the brick fireplace, physically positioning himself as the new, unquestioned authority of the house. He unspooled the string on his pristine manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. He did not offer copies to anyone. He cleared his throat. He said he knew this was difficult, but our grandmother had wanted things settled cleanly. As her appointed executor, he claimed he was legally obligated to carry out her final wishes without delay. Then he began reciting the terms. The previous will, the one our grandmother had kept in a metal firebox for 20 years, divided her assets equally among all her children and grandchildren. It was the ultimate reflection of her sense of fairness. This new document, however, systematically stripped every single one of us out of the estate. Every word Marcus spoke consolidated power and wealth directly into his own hands. The cedar-shingled house near the water, the vintage car parked in the garage, the heirloom jewelry. All of it was now exclusively designated to Marcus and his immediate branch of the family. The rest of us were left with nothing but sentimental trinkets and photographs. When he finished reciting the distribution of physical assets, he paused. He looked around the room, making sure everyone was sufficiently stunned before dropping the final, most devastating piece of information. He casually adjusted his shirt cuffs and stated that the bulk of her liquid assets, her checking accounts, a high-yield savings account, and a modest investment portfolio, had been heavily depleted during her hospital stay. He claimed those primary accounts were nearly empty. The cash, he said, had been consumed by massive uncovered medical expenses, private nursing fees, and emergency home maintenance. A low murmur of shock rippled through the room. My grandmother had excellent health insurance and a robust federal pension from my grandfather's military service. There was no conceivable way she had burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in a matter of weeks. The math was entirely fabricated. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" my uncle asked, his voice shaking. "She had a very comfortable safety net. How could the primary accounts possibly be empty?" Marcus sighed. It was an exaggerated theatrical performance of a weary caretaker dealing with ungrateful relatives. "Medical care is expensive," he replied. "You were not there every day like I was. You did not see the bills piling up while you were all busy with your own lives." I watched him closely from the edge of the hallway. His posture was too rigid. His eye contact was too aggressive, too challenging. He was daring anyone to question his authority on the very day we buried her. He was relying on our collective exhaustion and sorrow to force this massive theft through without scrutiny. I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely stripped of emotion. I did not raise my pitch. I simply asked a basic procedural question. "Marcus," I said gently, "if the accounts were drained for medical expenses, there should be an itemized ledger. I am going to need you to provide a full accounting of those transactions and show us the exact dates those funds were moved." Marcus snapped his head toward me. The polite caretaker mask vanished instantly, revealing the deep, ugly condescension beneath. He looked at me, taking in my dark funeral dress, completely dismissing the naval officer underneath it. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Sarah, you have never handled real law," he sneered, his voice loud enough to echo in the quiet room. "You process court-martials. You chase missing government property. You do not understand real estate, and you do not understand real business. This is civil probate. The power of attorney was ironclad, and the will is final. Go back to base and let the adults handle the family affairs." He dismissed me to my face in front of our entire family, standing in the very house our grandmother had built. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. My family looked from Marcus to me, waiting for the explosion. They knew I had a reputation for relentless cross-examinations. They expected me to rip into him, to shout him down, to start a massive verbal war right there in the living room. But I did not. In my profession, anger is a tactical error. Facts over feelings. Sometimes silence is the heaviest weapon you can deploy. I knew that if I argued with him without proof, it would just become a family shouting match. It would devolve into a bitter emotional dispute, and civilian courts despise emotional disputes. I needed hard, irrefutable data. I needed to let him feel completely victorious so he would get sloppy. I looked right into his eyes. I offered a short, single nod. "Understood," I said. I did not argue. I did not threaten him. I simply turned around and walked toward the front door. As I moved through the dining room, I passed the long oak table where Marcus had carelessly set the manila envelope and the stack of documents down to pour himself a glass of water. My eyes caught the signature page of the new will resting on top. I stopped. I did not touch the paper. I just looked at the date, stamped in heavy black ink next to the notary seal. It was dated a specific Tuesday in late October. My mind instantly flashed back to the hospital room. I remembered sitting by my grandmother's bed in the dim light. I remembered the exact evening she looked right through me and called me by my late mother's name. I remembered the absolute fog in her eyes, the total, irreversible disconnect from reality. That heartbreaking moment of profound cognitive failure happened exactly 14 days before the date stamped on this supposed final will. There were 14 days between the date my grandmother lost all legal capacity to understand a contract and the date Marcus claimed she willingly signed away her entire life's legacy. He had not checked the math. He assumed no one would ever pull the hospital records. He assumed a grieving family would just fold in the face of his loud confidence. And most dangerously, he assumed a Navy judge advocate was just a glorified secretary in a uniform who did not understand real law. I walked out the front door into the freezing Rhode Island air, pulled my wool coat tight against the wind, and got into my car. I did not drive home. I drove straight back to the naval base, unlocked my office, and turned on the bright overhead lights. The mourning period was over. The investigation had just begun. The freezing air coming off Narragansett Bay rattled the heavy glass windows of the older brick buildings. But inside my office, there was only the steady hum of the climate control and the sharp, bright light of my desk lamp. I did not let myself cry. Grief is a luxury you indulge only after the perimeter is secure. Right now, there was a hostile actor inside the wire. Marcus was moving incredibly fast, and he was relying on the fact that the rest of the family was too emotionally paralyzed to stop him. He thought my silence in that living room was a retreat. It was not. It was a recalibration. My objective was singular. I needed to build a timeline that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that our grandmother lacked the legal capacity to execute those documents. If I could shatter the timeline, the will and the power of attorney would instantly collapse. In the military, when you investigate a crime, you start by establishing a baseline of facts. I needed two distinct sets of data. First, her daily cognitive assessments from the hospital staff. Second, the exact timestamps of every dollar moved out of my grandmother's accounts. I reached out to a quiet ally. Dr. Arrington was a retired Navy trauma surgeon who now served on the medical board at the very regional hospital where my grandmother had passed. He was an old mentor and someone I had helped untangle a massive logistics issue for a few years prior. He owed me a favor, and he was fiercely protective of the elderly patients in his care. Early Monday morning, I met him in his small, cluttered office. I laid out the dates Marcus had claimed, the empty bank accounts, and the sudden appearance of the new will. Dr. Arrington's jaw tightened. Medical professionals despise elder abuse. They despise seeing a family member swoop in like a vulture when a patient is defenseless. Because I was a direct, recognized next of kin, and the legal executor had not yet formally barred me through a court order, I was legally entitled to request her medical files. Dr. Arrington personally expedited the formal discovery request through the hospital's massive archives department. While I waited for the medical files, I needed the banking timestamps. I called my aunt, who still had joint signer status on one of my grandmother's smaller secondary checking accounts. Marcus had drained the primary funds, but he had ignored this smaller account, likely thinking it was insignificant. Through that joint access, my aunt was able to request a complete transaction ledger from the bank manager, detailing every electronic transfer and wire made out of my grandmother's entire portfolio during those final months. For 3 weeks, I maintained absolute silence. 3 weeks of Marcus strutting around our hometown playing the wealthy, burdened heir, entirely unaware that a trap was being built right beneath his feet. He assumed the female Navy lawyer had folded, just like he predicted. Overconfident antagonists always get careless. They assume no one will ever check their math. Have you ever watched someone build an elaborate web of lies, knowing you hold the exact piece of paper that will bring it all down? Tell me in the comments if you would confront them privately or let them fall in a public courtroom. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, 2 heavy courier envelopes arrived at my office. I shut my door. I turned off my desk phone. I placed the hospital's daily medical capacity evaluations on the left side of my desk. I placed the bank's transaction ledgers on the right. I took out a red pen and I began mapping the timeline. In my line of work, you review files about theft, insubordination, and broken contracts. But examining a sterile medical chart detailing the rapid decline of your own grandmother is a different kind of pain. I had to force myself to breathe steadily as I reviewed the daily nursing notes. I saw descriptions of her struggling to swallow, staring blankly at the ceiling and calling out for people who had been dead for 20 years. It was agonizing. But that agony fueled my focus. I forced myself to look past the tragedy of her decline and focus purely on the mechanics of the timeline. The truth of the 14-day gap emerged in devastating, undeniable clarity. On the 12th of October, the chief neurologist noted a complete loss of orientation. The chart stated that the patient was unresponsive to basic commands and completely lacked legal capacity to make medical or financial decisions. Then I looked at the bank ledger. On the 14th of October, 2 days after that medical entry, Marcus used his shiny new power of attorney to wire $45,000 out of her primary checking account directly into a private limited liability company he owned. On the 18th of October, another $60,000 vanished into a different account bearing only his name. And finally, on the 26th of October, exactly 14 days after she lost the ability to recognize her own doctors, the supposedly newly drafted final will was notarized. The overlap was perfect. It was absolute, irrefutable proof. Marcus had executed those massive withdrawals and allegedly secured her signature on a complex new will, while the hospital's own doctors were simultaneously documenting that she could not even state her own name. The power of attorney was void the moment she lost capacity, yet he had continued to use it like a blank check. A power of attorney is not a license to steal. It requires the agent to act in the principal's best interest. Draining her accounts to prop up his shiny suits and leased cars while she lay dying was a flagrant, textbook violation of fiduciary duty. And the new will. The notary stamp was a complete fabrication. He had relied on a sleazy associate to rubber stamp the document without ever stepping foot inside that hospital room. I sat back in my chair and stared at the red lines connecting the two pieces of paper. The arrogant cousin who dismissed my career, who mocked my military service, had left a paper trail so wide and so obvious, a first-year law student could have caught it. I carefully placed the documents into a plain, heavy manila folder. I locked it in my secure desk drawer. If you ever find yourself holding the very proof that will destroy someone who wronged you, do not rush. Hold your fire. Let them commit entirely to their lie. Let them stand in front of an authority figure and swear it is the truth right before you hand over the documents. I intended to file a formal petition in probate court to challenge the will by the end of the month, methodically dismantling his claim during the standard probate schedule. But late Friday evening, my cell phone rang. It was an old neighbor of my grandmother, a woman who resided next door to our family for 40 years. Her voice was frantic. She was calling to ask why there was a strange crew of men carrying furniture out of the cedar-shingled house. My blood ran cold. Marcus was not waiting for the probate court to validate the will. He knew the accounts were empty, and he needed more capital. He had quietly listed the family anchor, the house itself, for an immediate, under-the-table cash sale. He was advertising it as a distressed estate liquid asset, pricing it hundreds of thousands of dollars below market value to ensure a rapid, unquestioned closing. He was trying to liquidate the physical estate before anyone could raise a formal objection. And the new buyers were walking through the front door that very minute. The stakes had just shifted from stolen bank funds to the permanent loss of our family's sanctuary. If Marcus finalized an under-the-table cash sale and transferred the deed to a third-party buyer, unwinding that transaction in civil court could take years. The cedar-shingled house, the pine floors, the dining room where we celebrated every major milestone, it would all be gone, locked behind endless litigation and good-faith purchaser protections. I did not drive to the house to scream at the moving crew. Panic and rage are tactical errors. When an adversary accelerates their timeline, the objective is not to match their chaos. The objective is to freeze the board. I spent the entire night in my office. I drafted an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order, asking the probate court to immediately halt any and all transactions involving the estate. To secure the freeze, I attached the initial page of my grandmother's medical incapacity assessment, but I deliberately held back the full side-by-side timeline of the banking withdrawals. I gave the court just enough smoke to prove there was a fire, without revealing the entire weapon I had built. First thing Monday morning, I stood at the filing window of the Newport County Courthouse. By noon, a judge reviewed the preliminary filing and granted the emergency injunction. A deputy sheriff drove directly to the house and served the order halting the cash sale just hours before the closing signatures were scheduled. The estate was legally locked down. A mandatory evidentiary hearing was set for 2 weeks out. When Marcus received the court order, his facade of the wealthy, unbothered executor completely shattered. He realized he was no longer fighting a grieving family in a living room. He was fighting a legal maneuver he did not understand. So he used the stolen funds to hire the loudest, most aggressive civilian attorney he could find. 2 days later, the phone in my base office rang. "Lieutenant Commander!" A sharp, aggressive male voice barked through the receiver. He did not bother introducing himself properly. A classic intimidation tactic designed to put the listener on the defensive. "My name is Mr. Vance. I represent the executor of this estate. I am calling to tell you that your little stunt at the courthouse is going to cost you dearly." Vance was a known entity in the local courts. He specialized in loud bullying tactics. He was the kind of attorney who believed that overwhelming opposing counsel with rapid-fire jargon and theatrical aggression was the exact same thing as a sound legal argument. He was exactly the kind of man Marcus would hire. I leaned back in my chair. "Mr. Vance," I said evenly, "I assume you are calling to discuss the temporary restraining order." "I am calling to tell you to drop it," Vance snapped. "I know your type. You military lawyers think you can march into a civilian jurisdiction and throw your weight around. You spend your days prosecuting 20-year-olds for missing curfew. You do not know the first thing about complex estate litigation. My client holds a valid, notarized, final will and a durable power of attorney. If you force a hearing, I will petition the judge to make you personally liable for the legal fees of the estate. Back down, Sarah, before you embarrass yourself." He was using volume to compensate for a lack of substantive facts. It was painfully obvious that Marcus had not told his attorney the entire truth. Marcus had likely handed Vance the will and the power of attorney, claiming a disgruntled, jealous cousin was simply causing trouble. Vance had not done his due diligence. He was relying on the assumption that a woman in a military uniform operating outside her standard jurisdiction would fold under the threat of aggressive litigation and financial ruin. I did not raise my voice. I did not return his aggression. In cross-examination, you never interrupt an adversary while they are digging their own grave. "I appreciate your counsel, Mr. Vance," I said calmly, "but the restraining order remains in place. I will see you and your client in court." "You are making a massive mistake," Vance growled and slammed the phone down. That brief interaction confirmed my exact strategy. They were walking into the hearing completely blind, armed with nothing but loud confidence and a forged notary stamp. The 2 weeks leading up to the hearing were intensely quiet. My extended family was a nervous wreck, terrified that Marcus and his expensive lawyer were going to steamroll us. I instructed my aunts and uncles to maintain total silence. I told them not to call Marcus, not to post anything online, and not to engage in any family gossip. Maintain absolute discipline. Let him believe he holds the unquestioned high ground. When you know you are walking into an ambush, the hardest thing to do is absolutely nothing. You have to endure the taunts, the threats, and the heavy weight of the waiting. But patience is how you win. The truth does not need to shout. It just needs to be documented. For 14 days, I prepared with exact, quiet focus. I organized my plain manila folder. I placed the certified copies of the bank ledgers in one section. I placed the heavily authenticated medical records from Dr. Arrington in another. I drafted a concise, factual brief that removed all emotion, all familial resentment, and laid out the pure mechanics of the fraud. In the military, we call this stripping the emotion from the mission. You do not win by proving someone is a bad person. You win by proving their timeline is a physical impossibility. The morning of the probate hearing arrived with a cold, biting wind whipping off the Atlantic. I wore my Navy service dress blue uniform, the gold stripes sharp against the dark fabric. The uniform was not a theatrical prop. I had a mandatory briefing on base immediately after the hearing, so it was the required uniform of the day. But I also knew the subtle psychological weight it carried in a civilian courtroom. It communicated discipline, precision, and an absolute respect for the law. I walked into the old, wood-paneled courtroom exactly 15 minutes early. The space smelled of floor wax and aged paper. I sat alone at the petitioner's table. I placed my single plain manila folder on the polished oak surface. I did not open it. At precisely 9 o'clock, Marcus and Attorney Vance swaggered through the heavy double doors. They took their seats at the respondent's table, projecting pure arrogance. Marcus was wearing a new, aggressively tailored charcoal suit, looking exactly like a man who believed he had outsmarted his entire family. He leaned back in his chair, whispering something to Vance, and both men smirked in my direction. They saw a woman with no co-counsel, no expensive briefcase, and no apparent civilian experience. They genuinely believed this would be a 10-minute route, where a local judge swatted away a nuisance complaint. They sat there, looking incredibly smug, completely unaware of the devastating side-by-side timeline resting inside the plain manila folder directly across from them. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the heavy oak door behind the bench swung open. The presiding authority was Judge Thomas. He was a veteran jurist in his early 60s, known for running a strict, no-nonsense docket. He settled into his heavy leather chair, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the preliminary file. Vance stood up. He did not simply address the court. He performed for it. He buttoned his suit jacket, paced the short distance behind his table, and projected his loud, aggressive voice to fill the entire room. He began by painting Marcus as a devoted, exhausted caretaker who had sacrificed his own business to manage his dying grandmother's affairs. He claimed Marcus used the durable power of attorney exactly as intended to cover massive medical and maintenance expenses. Then Vance pivoted to attack me. Your Honor, what we have here is a classic case of family jealousy disguised as a legal grievance, Vance boomed, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. He pointed at me, sneering that, despite my military uniform, I had no standing and no evidence. He called me a disgruntled relative trying to use my government credentials to intimidate his client. He waved the newly minted will in the air, declaring they had a valid, durable power of attorney and a properly notarized final will. He concluded his performance by demanding the injunction be lifted immediately and asked the judge to force me to personally pay all of their legal fees. Vance sat down heavily, looking immensely satisfied. Marcus shot a triumphant sideways glance across the aisle. They had established their narrative. They genuinely believed a stamped document was an impenetrable shield. Judge Thomas turned his attention to my table. He did not look impressed by the volume of the defense, but he needed to see my counter. Counselor, the judge said, his voice neutral. Your opposing counsel has presented signed, notarized documents. Your emergency filing claimed irregularities, but you provided minimal evidence to secure the temporary freeze. What exactly are you claiming is invalid here today? I stood up. I smoothed the jacket of my uniform, picked up my plain manila folder, and stepped out from behind the table. I did not match Vance's volume. I did not pace. I spoke in the measured, exact cadence of a military legal briefing. "Your Honor," I said quietly, "I am not claiming my cousin was a poor caretaker. I am not claiming family jealousy. I am claiming that the timeline presented by the respondent is a medical and physical impossibility." I opened the folder. I approached the bench and handed the clerk 3 heavily authenticated packets, providing identical copies to the defense table. I stated for the record that Exhibit A contained the daily certified cognitive capacity evaluations from the attending medical staff at the regional hospital. Exhibit B contained the full transaction ledgers from my grandmother's primary banking accounts. Vance stopped smirking. He quickly opened his copy. He suddenly realized he did not know what was in those packets because his client had never told him the entire truth. The respondent claims he used a valid power of attorney to execute emergency financial transactions, I stated, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. However, a power of attorney is legally voided the moment the principal loses the capacity to direct those actions. If you look at Exhibit A, on October 12th, the chief neurologist documented a total loss of orientation. She could not speak her own name. She lacked all legal capacity. I turned slightly, locking eyes with Marcus. The color was rapidly draining from his face. "Now, Your Honor, please reference Exhibit B," I said, turning back to the judge. On October 14th, 2 days after absolute incapacity was medically declared, the respondent executed a wire transfer of $45,000 directly into his own private limited liability company. On October 18th, another $60,000 was transferred to a separate personal account. These were not medical payments. They were unapproved, self-directed liquidations. Vance jumped up his chair, scraping loudly against the wood floor. "Objection! Your Honor, my client was acting within the broad authority granted." "Overruled." Judge Thomas snapped his eyes, never leaving the documents in front of him. "Sit down, Mr. Vance." I took a slow breath and delivered the final blow. "Finally, Your Honor," I said, my voice cold and exact. The respondent submitted a supposedly final will, allegedly signed by my grandmother and notarized on October 26th. That is exactly 14 days after she was medically documented as entirely unresponsive to basic commands. She did not sign that document. She could not have signed that document. The notary stamp is fraudulent, and the will is a complete fabrication. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that falls right before a massive collapse. Judge Thomas placed the 2 stacks of paper side by side on his bench. He picked up his reading glasses. He looked at the medical chart, tracing the date with his pen. Then he looked at the banking ledger. He looked at the date on the new will. He traced the timeline exactly as I had done in my dark office weeks ago. For 2 full minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustling of heavy legal paper. Vance looked at Marcus, his face pale and furious. He was quickly realizing that his client had lied to him and had just walked him straight into a heavily documented fraud trap. Vance was a loud bully, but he was not a fool. He knew his own professional license was now in profound danger. Judge Thomas finally looked up. He did not look at Vance. He looked directly at Marcus. His expression completely hardened into pure judicial disgust. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, "did you verify the medical state of the deceased before you stood in my courtroom and demanded I validate these documents?" "Your Honor, Vance stammered. His booming confidence entirely vanished. "My client assured me the documents were executed during periods of lucidity." Judge Thomas dropped the papers onto his desk with a loud smack. He leaned forward, looking directly at the defense table, and his voice cut through the room with devastating finality. Counsel, these withdrawal timestamps fall squarely inside a documented period of medical incapacity, Judge Thomas declared for the public record. This power of attorney was not lawfully exercised, and frankly, this is exactly the kind of case file I would expect a JAG officer to catch. Marcus physically shrank into his chair. The arrogant cousin who had sneered at my military service, who had stood in our family home and told me I did not understand real law, was just publicly dismantled by the highest authority in the room. Judge Thomas struck his gavel, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "The temporary injunction is made permanent," the judge ordered. "The October 26th will is struck from the record in its entirety, and the original will is reinstated. I am voiding every financial transaction executed after October 12th and freezing all of the respondents' private accounts until the stolen funds are fully recovered by the estate." The judge paused. He looked down at the forged notary stamp on the fraudulent will, then peered over the bench, looking directly at me. His eyes were grave. "Lieutenant Commander," Judge Thomas asked, his voice low and serious, "given the clear evidence of fraudulent conversion and a fabricated legal document, this court is prepared to formally refer this matter to the district attorney. Do you wish to pursue a felony criminal prosecution against your cousin today?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Marcus sat completely paralyzed at the defense table. His breathing was shallow, and his shoulders were rigidly hunched. The expensive charcoal suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. The reality of a felony prosecution, the prospect of handcuffs, mugshots, and a state penitentiary was finally crashing down on him. Attorney Vance did not say a single word. He was physically leaning away from his own client, entirely focused on protecting his own legal license from the blast radius of a forged document. The judge waited for my answer. I looked at Marcus. I saw the absolute terror in his eyes. For a brief, fleeting second, the anger I had suppressed since the funeral reception flared up in my chest. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to watch the bailiffs walk across the polished oak floor, put him in heavy steel restraints, and drag him out of the room. He had violated my grandmother's trust in her most vulnerable hours. He had treated the rest of our family with extreme malice, sneering at us while he quietly stole our history. A criminal conviction would have been absolute, brutal vengeance. But in my line of work, you learn a hard truth about vengeance. Vengeance is a fire that burns everyone it touches. If I initiated a criminal referral, the state would take over. There would be a massive, very public trial. The district attorney would subpoena my aunts and uncles to testify against their own nephew. Our family's grief, our grandmother's heartbreaking medical decline, and all of our internal fractures would be dragged into the open for months, maybe years. It would consume the family. It would turn the estate into a perpetual battlefield, destroying the exact peace my grandmother had spent 86 years building. My mission was never to destroy Marcus. My mission was to restore the anchor he tried to steal and to protect the people he tried to break. I looked back at Judge Thomas. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice completely steady. "No, Your Honor," I replied softly, letting the words carry across the quiet room. I declined to pursue a criminal referral at this time. My sole objective today is the complete restitution of the stolen funds and the equitable division of the estate exactly as my grandmother originally intended. The tension in the room instantly cracked. Marcus let out a ragged, audible gasp, burying his face in his hands. He was not crying out of remorse. He was crying out of sheer, overwhelming relief. Judge Thomas watched me for a long, quiet moment. He understood exactly what I was doing, and he understood the massive restraint it required to walk away from a perfect trap. He gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. "Very well, counselor," the judge said softly. The civil orders stand. The stolen capital will be clawed back from the respondents' private accounts immediately. This hearing is adjourned. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright, freezing Rhode Island afternoon. Marcus did not speak to me. He did not look at me. He practically ran down the concrete steps toward his leased car, leaving his furious attorney trailing far behind. The aftermath was quiet and exact. The bank compliance officers executed the judge's orders with absolute, uncompromising precision. Because Marcus had deposited the stolen funds directly into accounts under his own name, tracing and reversing the wire transfers was completely effortless. Every single dollar was pulled back into the estate. His private limited liability company collapsed almost immediately when the stolen capital vanished. To cover the remaining legal fees his attorney demanded for the disastrous hearing, Marcus was forced to quietly surrender his leased luxury car. Without the fake wealth to prop up his ego, the loud, arrogant cousin simply faded away. The original will, the one kept in the metal firebox for 20 years, was fully executed. The estate was divided fairly and equally among the entire family, exactly as it was meant to be. We did not sell the cedar-shingled house near the water. My aunts and uncles pooled their portions of the inheritance and placed the property into an irrevocable family trust. It remains the anchor of our family. The old pine floors still creak, the saltwater breeze still blows through the front windows, and the heavy stone mantel still holds the tightly folded American flag. Our family holidays are undeniably tense now. Marcus is still invited to Thanksgiving because our grandmother would have demanded it, but the dynamic has permanently shifted. He sits quietly at the far end of the long dining room table. He does not wear shiny suits anymore, and he no longer needs to be the loudest voice in the room. He knows, and everyone else knows, exactly how near he came to a jail cell. And he knows perfectly well who holds the key. He has never once brought up my military service again. Sometimes the people closest to you will mistake your quiet discipline for weakness. They will assume that because you do not shout, you do not know how to fight. They will rely on your grief, your exhaustion, or your gender to force their agenda through. Let them assume. Let them build their entire strategy on a foundation of massive underestimation. When you hold the truth, you do not need to raise your voice. You just need to secure the documents, build your timeline, and wait for the exact right moment to set the folder on the table. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one who controls the outcome. The person who controls the outcome is the one who studies the fine print. Would you have pushed for criminal charges, or was restoring the estate enough? Tell me your verdict below. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones rely on facts over feelings. And join me next time for another file from the archives.